Hello. Charlotte and I are here today to make up for the recitation I had to miss. I apologize for that. I think I mentioned maybe in the first week of the year that I have an autoimmune condition, and occasionally, randomly, I just get like super sick, unpredictably. So I woke up on Friday morning just super sick, and I was super sick for like 36 hours. And anyway, feeling better now. So as a way to make up for the fact you didn't get the chance to review Freud and Jung, we are here today, and I'm going to go through two of my favorite stories, actually, two of my favorite fairy tales that were assigned this week to do some sort of interpretation and review that you can take as an example, right? And then if anybody has further questions, you can send me an email. And obviously you didn't have recitation, so how are you going to comment? Make your second comment after the recitation on the discussion board, etc., etc. Don't worry about that. If you made one good recitation comment and you check out this video, that's good enough for an A this week, because obviously it was a trouble on my end, right? So let's look first. Yes, you are being so helpful. Let's look first at one of my very favorite fairy tales, which is The Snotty Goat. As an example of the sort of things that Bruno Bettelheim is talking about. So Bettelheim's a Freudian, and his whole premise is that the world of the fairy tale is absolutely chock-a-block with all of these symbols that actually encode, although it's implicit, right? It's not deliberate, that encode all of these developmental lessons for children that come out of the experience of all of us. Because, you know, Freud believes that his model of the mind, id, ego, and superego, the stages of childhood sexual development, the working of the brain in general, is a universal thing. And so Bettelheim says that fairy tales are an expression of this common psychic heritage that find expression particularly well in things like community-created tales, like in folklore. And that nobody's doing this consciously, but unconsciously they are implicitly going through all of these worthwhile lessons, and the reasons people like fairy tales so much, and the reasons they endure, and the reasons children find them so entertaining is actually because they're useful as guides to what's going on in their development. That's the theory. So, of course, I don't think we need to belabor id, ego, and superego, the ideas about integration, the ideas about progressing along from the oral stage up into the genital stage, right? That's covered in the lectures. But let's take a look at the Snotty Goat to get sort of an example, right? So Freud and Bettelheim tell us that in young children, it is entirely appropriate for sex and sexuality to be repressed in the conscious mind. And therefore, it is a job of all of us later in life, when we are mature enough and age appropriate and so forth, to unrepress that sex, right? So we get to maturity, physical maturity, and even to, almost the end of emotional maturity, but we've had sex repressed in us because that's appropriate for children. You don't want children to be explicitly sexual. But at some point you've got to undo that. And so it is the sort of last stage of maturation to turn sex, and because Freud is relentlessly homophobic, to turn sex with an appropriately aged other sexed partner into something that, instead of being sort of intimidating and maybe scary and a little gross, is seen as something good, all right? And his larger point in Bettelheim's too is not merely that you become physically ready for sex, but that you have to be emotionally ready for sex, right? And sort of psychically and mentally. And you need both partners to be ready if you're going to have a happy, not necessarily marriage, but just pairing, right? Happy relationship. And so the snotty goat kind of goes through this, right? So we see examples, when Bettelheim goes through the youngest child tales. We do the reading on the three kingdoms, or the three feathers and so forth, right? And an excellent example in our fairy tale book, the Russian fairy tale book, is the three kingdoms of copper, silver, and gold, right? You start out with this youngest child who is at the most minimal stage of development, and you see them symbolically in the tale overcome their older siblings by progressing through symbolic representations of the oral stage. And so you get consumption, or the anal stage, and you get greed. She's done with us. The anal stage, and you get signs of greed or messiness. The Oedipal stage, which of course is just business, right? Technically speaking, the phallic stage, which includes working through the Oedipal conflict. And then going into latency, this kind of period of quietude, right? And in fairy tales symbolized by a long journey or a sleep, like a literal sleep, Sleeping Beauty. And then finally emerging into the genital phase, which is this maturation, which is sort of what the snotty goat is dealing with here. Because, I love the fact the girl in the snotty goat, there lived a merchant, he had 3 daughters, and they have these dreams. And one of them dreams that she's going to be married to a goat. And Bettelheim would say that this kind of representation of the animal groom is the symbolic representation of the fact that sex has been repressed, and when we are at this cusp of maturation, we still see sex as being, gross and scary and, now the old man cat is yelling for attention. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you, buddy. So often, we have frog princes and frog princesses in Russia. We have, Beauty and the Beast, which we're very familiar with in the Western world, and here we have the snotty goat. And the father is like, no, don't go outside. You're gonna have to marry a goat. And this is some Oedipal stuff here. Freud would tell us that the Oedipal conflict is not always wholly resolved, even on the parent side. Theoretically, parents should be pushing the daughter out the door, even if what she's going to meet out there, come here. Ugh. Come here. Even if what she's going to meet out there is a beast, because the adult actually knows it's not really a beast after all. Father here is sort of like, no, don't go, daughter, but we all know that sometimes dads get like that, or so I've been told. In any case, she's like, stand aside, I'm going to meet my goat. And what I like about this is that from the very beginning of the story, she's good, she's ready to go, she's mature, she went through all the stages, we're fine. And so the story then becomes about him, right, about the goat. And she gets to his place, and the heads of his former lovers are on pikes out front, so he has not managed to make a relationship work in the past, in a very literal sense in the story, though Bettelheim would tell us that this is just a symbol for these past failures in a relationship. And once she gets in the house, she just starts doing womanly tasks. She just starts tidying up, and I particularly, from a Freudian standpoint, we are told he brought her to his house and put her to sleep on the shelf above the stove. Snot ran down his nose, slobber ran down from his mouth, and the unfortunate girl never stopped wiping him with a handkerchief, for she was not a bit squeamish. So, in other words, she's not a bit squeamish about his bodily fluids. And it is Freud we're talking about here. She's just cleaning up the space. She's ready to go. She's ready to be a wife. In a traditionally gendered sense. Right? We're doing feminism this week. The problem is him. And You know, thanks, buddy. Yeah. And are you my animal groom? I was like, yes. Bettelheim would tell us that sex is oftentimes intensely repressed in girls more than boys, which that kind of rings true, right? But in all the times that adults are telling girls to beware of boys, right, and their advances, boys also hear that, and Bettelheim suggests that they get the impression that maybe they are beastly, right? Maybe there is something scary and inappropriate about their sexual urges, right? And even if you're not thinking about this like really consciously, it's something that kind of you internalize. And so men can be very insecure at this stage, where they're not sure that maybe their desires are appropriate. Maybe they are gross. Maybe girls don't want them for a reason, right? Or whatever. And they need this kind of reassurance. And so here we see that girl goes to town, merchant's daughter's like dum-da-dum, and the goat disguises himself as a handsome youth and teases her, like, wife of a goat, wife of a snot nose. But she, this is a test. She passes the test. She slaps him in the face. She's like, get my goat's name out of your mouth, and goes home to the goat. And he does this 3 times. Just making sure, right, that in private, when she thinks he's not around, she's still comfortable with him. She still wants him, basically. And after he's reassured of this, he goes home and he throws out the goat skin. And many of these animal groom, animal spouse tales have this aspect to them, that, at a certain point, the beast casts off their beast skin and it's gone for good. And at that point, both parties are ready for an adult sexual relationship, is the symbol there. And so this happens. And she was ready to start with. Now he's ready to go. He's been massaged. He's sort of made peace with the anxieties that he had about this moment in his life, and they can be together. And so this is the culmination of the stage. So if we start back with youngest child tales, the youngest son feeling incompetent compared to his 2 older brothers or his father, and having these kinds of competitions with them, or these anxieties about being usurped by the father, or being outshone by the older brothers. We start clear back at the beginning of that journey. This is the end of the journey, and in between, the tales will embody symbols of those intervening stages. So, a Sleeping Beauty tale is about latency, right? That period where it sort of looks like nothing's happening on the surface, but it's still important to our psychological development to have to have a quiet moment before puberty hits. Or the oral or the anal stages, or of course the Oedipal conflicts of the phallic stage, this point in time when children begin to understand that there's a difference between male and female. And of course, again, Freud, besides being relentlessly homophobic, is just relentlessly about the gender binary. So there's no room for trans identity, and there's no room for homosexual identity, and there's no room for anything outside of that traditional, cis, hetero, binary. We just have to accept our history as it is, right? For all of its problems. But this idea that in this Oedipal conflict, children, and I mean this part at least fair enough, discover that there are physical differences between themselves and their brothers and sisters, right? And their mothers and their fathers. And that there's such a thing as gender. And we all get socialized that way, right? To think about the fact that, people who are called woman get treated differently than people who get called men, or accept that identity, or take it on themselves, or have it thrust upon them. In any case, right, that society treats these things as different, that they're considered physically different, and they're considered psychologically different. And children are old enough to recognize that difference. And I promise you, we do as a culture start putting that difference on them just immediately before they're aware of it. And then, of course, they become aware of it at a pretty young age, and it's already just embedded. And Freud would say that, this also manifests in, the Oedipal conflict is like, the boy wants to exclusively possess the love of his mother, which he doesn't consciously understand as sexual, but is theoretically preparing him for a future heterosexual relationship. And so he wants to get rid of the father, but then because children do this, they project. So, he projects his own desire and jealousy onto the father, so he assumes that his father wants to possess the mother exclusively and get rid of him, and the problem is the father can do it because he's much bigger and stronger than him, so we get into castration anxiety, like, what if he takes my phallus as punishment for... and so the way this would all play out, like in a fairy tale, is anytime you're going to have a big conflict between, the youngest son and his father, or the youngest son is the older brothers as a proxy for the father's power, or a king as a proxy for the elder power, or some figure like Cachet the Deathless as a proxy for the father's power, anything like that. On the girl's side, then, Freud is like, well, the girl wants to possess her father and get rid of her mother, again goes through this projection, thinks her mother has already castrated her, and so resents her for that. The girl then develops penis envy, which according to Freud, ladies, we never get rid of. We spend our whole lives wishing we had a penis, and that's what drives us into heterosexual relationships later. It's like a proxy possession of it. I'm not kidding you. Again, let's take this for what it is. But again, if a young woman is the heroine of the tale, this would play out in conflicts with mothers, with stepmothers, with queens or sorceresses, Baba Yaga, what have you. Right? And then on to latency, and then finally on to this genital stage where we undo this repression of sex, and our spouse is no longer a beastly animal. They are, in fact, a handsome or beautiful person. So this is the world of symbols that Bettelheim is dealing with as a Freudian. Jung, student of Freud's, has a more complex view of the psyche than just id, ego, and superego. Has the vision both of the personal unconscious, but also of the collective unconscious. And so you have the ego and the shadow facing off in a way. The ego is the conscious side, the shadow is the unconscious side. You have the persona as the conscious side, and the anima or animus, which is a woman's masculine side, a man's feminine side. Again, we're relentlessly in the gender binary here. As the unconscious, but then in the collective unconscious, we also have all these archetypes, which I think is the most interesting thing about Jung, to be honest. And I actually think that Jung's using archetypes in this way is actually an interesting way to think about fairy tales. I think personally, Jung is a more useful way to maybe understand the symbols of fairy tales. And of course, for Jung, the idea is that we all share as humans, just evolved in our brains over time as we were evolving as a species. We all share in our brains this conceptual mechanism by which we understand and interpret the world through these symbolic personages and objects. And an important thing to remember is that because those personages and objects, the Great Mother, the Sacred Round, there's a lot of them. I mean, you look up a list. In the discussion of Vasilisa the Beautiful, von Franz brings up a few. There's more. But these are unconscious things. And remember, what both Freud and Jung tell us about the unconscious is we can't get to it directly. You at no point in time can directly just be like, here's this unconscious thing, I'm bringing it into my consciousness, and I'm going to think about it and turn it around and look at it and analyze it and use it. Can't do that. You can only get at the unconscious through dreams. And Jung says maybe through art, right? Through that kind of creative, imaginative process where you're not sure exactly where the inspiration's coming from, but it's coming. And if any of you are creative, I mean, I think you understand that, right? If you're a writer, if you're an artist, if you're a musician, I think you've definitely at some point experienced that, like, man, it's just, it's coming out of somewhere, and you can't really say where, but it doesn't matter, just go with it, right? And so for Jung, that sort of thing, particularly, if you're talking about, painting, writing, visualizing in a way that would allow a projection of these archetypes, these unconscious archetypes, into the conscious world. So even if we can't get directly at the unconscious archetypes, we can project them involuntarily through our dreams, or maybe a little more voluntarily through art and other creative processes. And so then these become sort of culturally specific, right? Because the way we dream and the way we create, all of that's influenced by the reality of the cultures that we grew up in, that we live in. And so the manifestation of the Great Mother archetype for Russians might be, or at least one of the manifestations, Baba Yaga, right? And in a different culture, a different manifestation, and in a third culture, a third manifestation. And it's all the same archetype, but because to consciously get at these archetypes, we only have these projections of the imagination or dreams. Those projections go through the filter of our individual cultures and take the forms they do as a result of that. So for Jung and Jungians, the interpretation of the fairy tale is about, one, analyzing it for the integration of these personality parts, right? The ego and the shadow, the persona and the anima animus, and then also in terms of the projection of these archetypes. So I'm going to turn to another of my favorite fairy tales, Maria Marevna. And so right away we have the figure in this story of Kosciey the Deathless. Screams archetype, right? Screams father archetype. Because if you think back to the beginning of the term, we were talking about Kosciey per se, even though he's very old, we know that he's extremely masculine, he's extremely virile, he's this figure that young men have to confront, have to sort of assimilate in a way, his ways, at least a little bit, into themselves, and also have to defeat him and replace him. You can see how this is a symbol of all kinds of like elder masculinity compared to a younger man. And this story is interesting to me because, one, I think we can understand Kosciey as Prince Ivan, his shadow. I think we can also understand Kosciey as Maria's overactive animus, because Jung would tell us that all the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche, even the shadow, the anima, the animus, you don't want to get rid of them. You want them to be in balance. So, for instance, he would say it's appropriate for a man to have a feminine side. It's appropriate for a woman to have a masculine side. You just wouldn't want either of them to be overwhelming. And then, of course, we get into homophobia and all of that, just, if your animus is too overactive, you might be a lesbian. Okay. Again, just taking it as we find it. So, when we think about, we have Ivan. He's surrounded by his sisters. They all get married, right? A whole year follows. Ivan is just, the first sister gets married, just walking in the garden with his sisters. Ivan just hanging out in the flowers with the ladies, carrying around his tiny silver spoon, right? Allowing for these traditional gender norms, we would say that he has an overactive anima. It's in the persona of his close identification with his sisters. It's in his sort of cloistering in this traditionally feminine space of the garden. He's carrying around this little silver spoon. You know, we know from thinking about Baba Yaga and things like that, the spoon is this sort of, you know, feminine symbol, right? I mean, you know, in the kitchen and that sort of thing, right? So he's an overactive anima. Meanwhile, we have Maria Marevna. Fantastic, right? I mean, Maria Marevna is fantastic. He made ready, walked, and one day beheld a host of troops lying slain on the field. If any man is alive here, let him answer me, who slew this great army. All this great army was slain by Maria Marevna, the beautiful queen. Prince Ivan went further, came upon white tents, and Maria Marevna, the beautiful queen, came out to meet him. Hail, prince! Whither is God taking you? And is it of your will or by compulsion? Brave knights do not travel by compulsion. Oh, okay, Ivan. Well, if you're not in a hurry, rest in my tents. She propositions him, right? You know, here she is in the, you know, the bodies of the dead lie littered in her wake on the battlefield, and she looks over Ivan and she's like, you'll do. Come into my tent. And he puts up a show, but obviously just says what she says. Personally, I think we can end the fairy tale here. This is great, the end. Happy ending. But that wouldn't be gender appropriate. All right. So we have Ivan, who has an overactive anima, and we have Maria, who has an overactive animus, and if the bodies of the many slain were not sufficient evidence, we find Cachet tied up in her closet, and she's trying to starve him to death, which I think Jung might understand as being like, she knows she knows something's a little out of balance in her psyche, and if Cachet is the symbol of this overactive animus that she has, she's trying to starve him out. She's trying to not let him overwhelm her. And when Ivan lets him out, he just completely overwhelms her, because we have the strange transformation. All of a sudden, this magnificent warrior queen becomes this totally helpless, like, damsel in despair, like, oh, I've been kidnapped, save me. The story, on the level of the storyline, right, she's been kidnapped by Cachet masculine archetype. In terms of the symbolic world, she has been completely overwhelmed by her animus, and her persona, which should by rights be feminine, is all that's left, completely separated from that animus. And so all that's left is this just super, like, helpless, like, oh no, help, you know, kind of womanish mess. The dangers of these things getting out of balance, Jung would say. And so now it's Ivan's job to step up and be a man, right? And then from there, I mean, one, we could kind of do, we could return to Freud for a second and think about Prince Ivan's sort of journey to rescue his princess. You know, he kind of anytime, if you're thinking, I'm gonna get Freud and Bettelheim now, if you're thinking about a story from a Bettelheimian or a Freudian point of view, anytime you're going on this sort of like journey with trials, it's a symbol for the maturation process under like a Freudian construction, a Freudian interpretation. So, you know, he goes and he meets the different birdmen who he takes lessons from, to get back to Jung and the idea of him, you know, sort of putting to rest his overactive anima and his persona becoming more masculine. You know, he goes and he talks to the bird husbands, and he sort of, you know, gets almost like information about being more manly, right? What to do. He takes lessons from them. He fights, or attempts to fight, Prince Ivan once and twice, right? We go through that whole business. he meets Baba Yaga. And we know that Baba Yaga, again, thinking back to the very beginning of the term, we were talking about Cachet, we were talking about Baba Yaga, I brought up the fact that Baba Yaga tends to be this sort of arbiter of gender performance in a way. That's one of the roles that she has in fairy tales. You know, good day, grandmother. Good day, Prince Yvonne. Why have you come? Of your own free will or from need? I have come to earn a mighty steed from you. You may try. Right? And when he completes the tasks that she sets for him, she's like, okay, here, have a mighty steed from me, right? Which is also, you know, the sort of token, the avatar of Cachet's manliness. So Baba Yaga, arbiter of gender, has decided that he is now manly enough. He goes, he fights Cachet, he defeats him, he frees his princess, and at the end of it, his anima is now reduced. Her animus is now reduced. She's appropriately feminine. He's appropriately masculine. His shadow, you know, because I said Cachet could also be a symbol of his shadow. His shadow is fully integrated, because if you think about Yvonne and Cachet for a second, they want the same thing. They want Maria. It's just that, you know, Cachet is the sort of dark, kidnappy, rapey way to get her, which is not appropriate. Yvonne takes the more appropriate path to getting Maria. And so the shadow desire remains. Because remember, Jung says, you don't get rid of the shadow. We can't, first of all. And so trying to is just going to lead to psychic problems. What we must do is contain these dark impulses, right? And just sort of learn to live with them and use them and integrate them into ourselves in a way that's not destructive. And so here, if we see Cachet as Yvonne's shadow, I said that shadow desire of possession of Maria is still present, but he did it the right way, right? Without going full bore into the Cachet shadow impulse. And then as far as Cachet goes as a symbol of Maria's animus, she's freed from her captivity, right? To be an appropriate wife. Now, I said all of this is problematic because of all the gender sexuality garbage from Freud and Jung. But anyway, this is a taste of how these interpretations work. I said, to me, Jung's is more useful than Freud's, insofar as I do think the idea of the sort of universal unconscious and its archetypes is an interesting one. It's like one of those things, like, is it true? I don't know if it's true, but I think it can be useful. So it doesn't matter if it's true in that sense, right? But for thinking about examples of, how to approach these fairy tale texts, we approach them with the idea in mind that the events that happen in the plot of the text are symbols of internal mental elements and processes. What symbols could those be? Are they masculine? Are they feminine? Are they dark? Are they benevolent? Are they weak or are they powerful? Are they tied to nature? Are they tied to civilization? Are they tied to death? Are they tied to fecundity? Right? Think through that sort of thing. I mean, we are, in talking about Cachet, clear back at the beginning of the term, we talked about the significance of the egg that hides his death. Right? The egg is the symbol of birth, and in that sense, his death actually re-enters him into the proper cycle of birth and death. Right? Like Jung would understand this. Right? The egg is as a sort of projection of an archetypal idea or object. Right? So that's the space we're in here. I will leave some space at the beginning of our next recitation if you have questions, which, this Friday. And like I said, don't worry about your second posts, because what could you do, right? So if you have one good post, and you watch this video, assuming you're all going to watch this video, you've all watched this video, you're good for this week. And like I said, if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email or bring it up on Friday during recitation. I'll leave some space for it at the beginning of the class. Okay, see you then.